So the whole idea here, sorry for the discombobulation, 6 sessions, traditions of secret knowledge from the ancient world to the Renaissance. And the first session is just setting the background, because what we're doing here is looking at the period that we're going to call the Hellenistic age, which is from the death of Alexander, which is in 323 BC. So really focusing on the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BC, and then into the Roman imperial period of the 1st century CE or AD, as the Christians refer to it. It's a world in which Alexander has established, as we'll talk about in a second, a unified Eastern Mediterranean into Asia Minor through his conquests, and that world has become Greek, but integrated the Asian and North African, Egypt in particular, worlds that it came to dominate with that Greek world. So, and out of this world is going to emerge an intellectual world order in which all of the grand religious traditions that we think of in the ancient world were born, and which shaped the evolution of Judaism, of Christianity, ultimately of Islam, and along the way spawned scores of what I call secret knowledge traditions. So this session is going to be talking about the background. Next session, we're going to be talking about mystery cults and Hellenistic Judaism. Third session, early Christianity and Gnosticism, and it's going to get weird, as we'll see. The fourth session, Neoplatonism, the so-called Corpus Hermeticum. I won't try to explain it now. We'll wait till we get there. And Manichaeanism. And then we're going to look at some medieval offshoots, the Cathars or Albigensians of France in the 13th century, and the Jewish Kabbalah. And I say the Jewish Kabbalah to distinguish it from something that we'll be talking about in the 6th session, which will be the Christian version of the Kabbalah as invented, if you will, by Pico della Mirandola and the various alchemists that had their heyday in that period. And we may even get into Rosicrucianism and some of the weirder hidden traditions that push into the 17th century. Anyhow, we begin with the Greek world because this is where it's going to begin. And the classical world, if you look at the map, Greece is that city-state society smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean. And Rome isn't a presence in the classical Greek period. And so if we look west, what we see are Etruscans, Ligurians, Iberians, Thracians. If we look east, we see Persians and the like. And by the way, if you have a question, because right now, until I get the handle on the new implementation of Zoom on the way I came into it here, I don't see the chat room. So let me know if you have something that you want to ask. Alexander from Macedonia dominates Greece, moves into what we would call Asia Minor or modern Turkey, pushes down into Egypt, and then all the way, if we follow the map, through those grand civilizations that existed in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, Babylonia, Assyria, all the way to the borders of India into Bactria, uh, all of Persia, everything above the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, uh, and brings the Greek world into real contact in a way that has never occurred before. They've been in contact along the Mediterranean edge, but not with the Greeks in a dominant position. But Egypt, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, all will become part of a unified world. So the reason Alexander goes east is, if we, referring back to the map we had just looked at, the previous one, is that there isn't anything to the west that becomes enviable or desirable. This is the world as you would want to approach it, the Eastern world, the world of the grand civilizations that had existed in antiquity. Classical Greeks prided themselves on their own culture, on their creativity, on their intellectual achievements, on their political models in particular. They really thought that the model of the polis was something worthwhile. They were very aware of their own achievements but they were also aware that they were, in some sense, an inferior civilization. That the grand imperial structures of the East were able to amass far greater wealth and to manifest it in a variety of ways that we'll talk about as we go on. Just a little overview of who had been in place in the Asia Minor universe and the Mesopotamian universe. As early as the 4th millennium BC, there were Sumerians and Akkadian empires in the river valley. If we jump, and we're jumping by leaps and bounds, if we jump 2,000 years later, in the Bronze Age, the Hittites that threatened even the Egyptian domination of northeastern Africa at the time, and threatened to push into the Tigris and Euphrates, but were actually resisted a bit. The Assyrians in the Greek Archaic period that dominated even Egypt, the Babylonians of biblical fame. We know them through their domination of the Hebrews, who were brought into their captivity and destroyed the first temple in the 6th century BCE. And then, on a larger map, the ones that were in place during the Greek classical period, the world of Cyrus the Great and Xerxes, who fought a series of wars with the Athenians and Spartans and the other city-states of the the Greek mainland, and who presented this kind of polyglot empire to the Greek world, which they attracted Alexander when it came his time and the century following, because this was an empire that spoke 10 languages. This was an empire that integrated and assimilated 10 cultures. When we read Herodotus and his history of the wars with Persia, the great armies of Xerxes come over with units by nationality, speaking different languages and various exotic modes of dress and weaponry brought with them. This is the world that Alexander is headed straight for. And the reason this world was so attractive is because of the two river valleys, the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, because agriculture, remember we used to call the the area, the Fertile Crescent, because of the intensity of agricultural production. It supported a population level that allowed cities to become metropolises, something that was totally unknown in Greece. Athens, at the height of its war with Sparta, was, even if you counted slaves, was probably not 100,000 people. But in the cities of Persia, several of the cities, not all of which had Persian character. Some of them had Babylonian character. Some of them had Akkadian character. But these cities were of significant size. And so they had huge social stratification. They had hierarchies. There were bureaucracies in Egypt and in Mesopotamia that would have been totally unknown in the Greek world. It's the world of what one of the historians of this period like to call Oriental despotism, which Greek commentators were very aware of. They regarded the centralized top-down imperial structure of these empires as a direct contrast to their own society. It was a mark of what they called barbarians, but not barbarians in the sense of savage, really barbarians in the sense of different, barbarians in the sense of alien, barbarians in the sense of other. So their achievements, their cultural achievements in areas like astronomy and art were highly respected by the Greek world. I mean, when the Greeks saw things like the pyramids or the gardens, the hanging gardens of Nebuchadnezzar, they were shocked. This is something, they came from the hill country. They came from, by comparison, they were from the Ozarks, and they've come to the big city, and they recognize the big city as something special. The palace society and the multiculturalism in those palaces would have been astonishing to Greek eyes. The succession of political overlords in the palaces rested on a foundation of agricultural activity that was consistently maintained, as I say here in that bottom paragraph, through assimilation. In other words, the peasants on the ground would have continued speaking whatever local argots they spoke, and it was the overlord classes that were sort of switching seats in the musical chairs game that these cultures played over several centuries. And indeed, if you remember in the book of Genesis in the Tower of Babel, I tried to get a picture of that in the lower right. The polyglot culture that emerged was abhorrent to the ancient Israelites. It was a challenge to God, and it was prideful. But to the Greeks, it was magical. It was attractive. It was something to be seen and studied. Anyhow, Alexander makes his move east, establishes a very thin layer of Greek control over the worlds of Asia Minor and Egypt. And then at the age of 33, I think it's 33, he promptly dies. So what happens in the aftermath is that 4 generals hack up the conquests and establish kingdoms of their own. So if you then look at this map is projected from about the year 300 BC or BCE, before the Common Era. And it's Egypt, the Egypt of the Ptolemies. It's the Seleucid Empire. It's the Macedonian Empire. And the kingdom of Pontus. It actually it starts off as about a half a dozen, and then it merges into four consolidated ones. When I say a thin Greek layer, I mean this was not the people in these regions were not Greeks. The ruling class at the very top may have been, but each ruling class would have been assimilated into what were the remaining ruling classes of the predecessors. So you would have had people going native, but maybe in Egypt, maybe there were 50,000 Greek speakers, native Greek speakers. The thing is, though, that Greek culture was suddenly imported into these regions. And as I say at the bottom, in that blurb at the bottom of this slide, from polis to empire, when I'm talking about the successor kingdoms, in the wake of Alexander, Egypt and the East had a Greek ruling class who didn't arrive on their own. They came with what I'm going to call a fully fledged cultural curriculum. The political, social, and religious institutions remained largely as they were, but with an added overlay of Greek scientific, philosophical, and literary ideas. And I'm going to speak about this in the subsequent slides. I can't emphasize this enough. Greeks developed a kind of literacy that was not reserved for priesthoods or specific castes, a kind of literacy that was based on prose, not liturgies, not accountings, not just economics the way we would have found in some other places. This was a literacy that was truly intellectual in the general sense of the term. It was scientific, it was philosophical, it was literary. And nobody else had this, which made the Greek language desirable to locals who wanted in on these new cultural advantages, these new excellences. They wanted to get into the tradition. Now, many of you, because you've taken the history of Greeks class with me, have seen this diagram before. I had used it in that setting to talk about that box up at the top, to argue that the cultural transition that took place in Greece over a period of about 400 years, from about 800 to 400 BC, was one of a triple movement. That was there were three aspects, sounds like the Trinity, three aspects of a single movement. Tribal organization morphed into political organization, the entity of the polis, small little city states, that the medium of communication went from oral and epic poetry and formulaic narratives for singing into literary transmission, the invention of prose, which allows you to write history, to do science, to have discursive philosophical conversations. It is literally discursive. The advantage of prose is that you don't have to use tricks and devices to remember things. You just refer 20 pages back. You go back to chapter 2. You can stop time and do analysis without having to waste all of your calories just trying to remember the bloody text. And the third aspect of this transition is the movement from mythic explanations and religious cosmogonies to analytic explanations of the universe, rationalism, abstract thought, the sciences. Uh, this is what the Greeks had done in their own intellectual classes um, by the time of Alexander. And in fact, by the time of Alexander, it had expanded past the classical period, and you had schools of thought and people building libraries and the like, so that it was uh, a curriculum that you could package at that point. And I talk about it at the bottom here. Um, I say in literary culture, ideas apply more to the whole and the general, abstracted from the specific. Most notably, the flow of time is stopped. The reader can go back and evaluate in a still reflective frame of mind. There's opportunity to measure, compare, and judge. And Alexander's great significance is not someone to make romantic movies about, but his great significance is that he established the Hellenistic world dominated by the Greek language and its books. He made them available to a world that was going to be interested in them. Soon after Alexander, within 100 years, as I'll mention in a slide or two, the Roman world will have expanded, gotten interested in the Eastern Mediterranean. And when they come up against that same Greek Hellenistic world by the middle of the 2nd century, when they're really in a cultural position to take a close look at it, they adopt it as well. So all the Latin models of literature and oratory and letter writing and science and philosophy, Stoic philosophy, which was very interesting to the Romans, they used Greek models. And Athens, by the time of Cicero, by the time of the late Republic, so now we're talking the 1st century BC, Athens was what Paris was to Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was where you went to learn everything that you needed to know, where the flowering of the arts happened to be, where the flowering of thought happened to be, in the Enlightenment, for instance. It was where you went for your education. And it was Alexander who sort of created that model. So the first literature, while the Greek epics and some lyrical poetry were written down by the 7th century BC, it really was in the 5th century that prose came to the forefront. And in that 5th century, the histories of Herodotus, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, they usher in a literature. And the century that followed advances in all the intellectual arenas were published in scroll form. The codex hadn't been invented yet, was soon to be invented, but not quite yet. So that by the time of Alexander, the institutionalization of libraries and academies had begun. Greek became the language of discourse because it had no rivals. If you were going to be educated, learn to read Greek. It wouldn't become the lingua franca of the lowest classes, except it actually did in certain little parts of the world. It became the second language that people knew, much the way that in the Middle Ages you had to learn Church Latin if you were going to be educated, no matter what you spoke at home, no matter what kind of Proto-French or Proto-Italian or Proto-German you were speaking in your small rural town. If you wanted to learn about the outside world, you learned Latin. The great library at Alexandria, which burned down in the first century BC because of Julius Caesar. But the library was part of a large research institution, the um, Museum in Greek, built by the Ptolemies of Egypt. It had a collection that people estimated as 400,000 rolls. This would have been like a university library. Many famous scholars in residence. I just mentioned people who were associated with the library during the Hellenistic period. And you had people like Hero of Alexandria with his steam engine, Eratosthenes, who correctly calculated the circumference of the earth. I mean, he had it at close to 25,000 miles. Xenotidas, Callimachus, Polonius of Rhodes. Anyhow, on we go. I have this slide here mentioning the pre-Socratics up, and because of the next slide, I'm going to mention Plato and Aristotle, but these are the people who precede them, because these are the guys in the Golden Age, 550 to 430, who invented, if you will, the categories of analysis that logic, philosophy, and science were going to use. So much of the discourse when we are reading early Christian texts, when we're reading Gnostic texts or Manichaean texts, many of the categories and the uses of terms were invented by people in this period. Pythagoras and his investigation of number and the relationship of number to the physical world. I mean, suddenly it was the Greeks who became very sensitive to the idea that number was a descriptor of the physical world, and raised the question: was it a descriptor, or did they really exist in some other sense? What is it? What is number measure? What is it exactly? The Milesians, who introduced Anaximander and Anaximenes, the concept of a substrate, the idea that the stuff of the physical material of the universe is not as it seems. That to explain how things change, to explain how the acorn gets to be the oak tree, to explain what happens when you burn a piece of wood and wind up with a pile of ash, that things happen at a below the surface level. To explain change, you had to think of what things were like internally. Heraclitus, who proposed the idea that there was structure in the universe, that there's a logos, there's something you could understand about the nature of things. It wasn't just in the perceptual surface observations. There were principles, there were laws, there were things that always happened or never happened. And that the physical world is in this constant state of flux. You had Parmenides and Zeno, who raised core issues about the nature of logic. When you say the ice melted and became water, well, the meaning of ice didn't change. So how does language work? Ice is still ice. The concept ice didn't melt and become the concept water. Ice is always ice as a logical idea or a word. So what's the relationship of language and thought to the physical world? What are the rules of thought and logic? The atomists, the people who suggested that the one way you could explain physical change was by arguing that underneath it was composed of complex, myriad complex, unobservable units, atoms, as they call them. We still use the term. And then the great sophists of the age of Socrates and Plato, who raised fundamental epistemological questions, whether objective knowledge was even possible, because these people specialized in arguing everything from every point of view. And then raised the question, well, what could you really know? And then the great character Socrates, who we have nothing of except the devoted notes of his student Plato, who makes him this arch character in all of his dialogues, and who seems to have developed a kind of deductive logic that Plato would make famous later on. And then, of course, the Titans, and I mention them here as Titans because in Plato and in Aristotle, you had two people that understood for the first time, because the time was right in the 4th century, to have this understanding that everything was linked. And to understand anything, you were going to, in effect, start trying to understand everything. They began looking for grand unifying theories. Plato was the first of these comprehensive system builders. He took all the questions raised by everybody before him, and the relationship of ideas and language to the physical world, the possibility of objective truth, the foundation of ethics and politics. He dabbled in everything, saying it was all linked. The 20th century partner of Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, who co-wrote the Principia Mathematica, once famously declared in the first quarter of the 20th century that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, the famous remark. Plato's theory of forms, which we will come up against a lot when we start talking about arcane religious theories. Plato will make a very predominant appearance, and it will happen a couple of different ways. Was famous for his top-down approach, where he argued that abstract concepts like number and mathematics were superior to sensory particular perceptions. And his student Aristotle, who just flipped Plato on his head and wanted to argue for an empirical bottom-up approach, that you begin with, if you will, scientific observation of those particulars, and you build up to grander universal theories up at the top of the chain. So if one used mathematics as the basic model to proceed from, the other one used biology as the best model to proceed from. And Aristotle, who was tremendously influential in the Hellenistic period, lent it something that Plato could not have, which was this absolute inexhaustible effort at categorization and classification. This is the age of, if you will, if you've ever been to the Victoria and Albert Museum and wandered into the glass or ceramic exhibits, where they have about 9 acres of small glass and ceramic objects, all categorized, all grouped by God knows what set of principles, you will see the fruition of Aristotle's invention that all observable small things should be gathered, should be named, should be classified, should be organized. The whole idea of libraries and museums and extensive collections rested on his very ample shoulders. He was known in the Middle Ages, in both Islamic world and in the Christian European world, as simply the philosopher. If Thomas Aquinas or if Averroes were to refer simply to the philosopher, everyone knew that they were talking about Aristotle. Also, Moses Ben Maimonides, the famous Jewish system builder, also regarded Aristotle as this fundamental titan. And then in the 4th century, the schools of Stoicism and Epicureans and Cynics and all these little subspecialty groups of philosophical positions and scientific ideas developed, and they actually built schools. You would go to the Stoa to study with Zeno and his fellow Stoics. This was all fodder for Alexander. Alexander, who, by the way, as you recall, was the student. Yeah.
Okay.
Aristotle the Macedonian, who was the student of Aristotle. And Aristotle, I guess, survives him. I'm trying to remember who dies first. Anyhow, and we wind
Alexander.
up. Alexander survives him. Okay.
Yeah.
And we wind up with a map of the Roman world and color coordinated so that you can see what the expansion was like. And you see that little hot purple button that was Rome and its suburbs in 500 BC. And it took 3 centuries to add what we think of as the boot of Italy. It wasn't until really 201 that they got that far, because they had to eliminate rivals like the Carthaginians and Hannibal, who came at them via Spain and across into the Alps. But if you look at their expanding, and this map is showing you the Republic, not the Empire of Rome. They are not an empire yet. We're not in the period of Augustus until the 30s BC. But smack dab in the early part of the Hellenistic period, Rome becomes a presence in the Western Mediterranean, even if they have not become an intellectual presence. But they butt up against the Macedonia, what's left of Macedonia in the period after Alexander by the better part of a century. And suddenly the Romans begin to be a presence in the area. By 150 BC, they've dominated all the yellow of Greece. They don't take it over as such. They just make them tributary. They don't consume them. The Romans had this wonderful technique of saying, no, carry on as usual. Just pay us a lot of tribute and do whatever we want you to do. I suppose like we're lecturing the Jordanians at the moment and how they should carry on. Anyhow, the Roman Republic will ultimately annex Macedonia and the other Hellenistic kingdoms as clients. And when they do this, they're buying into the curriculum as well. Now, since in much of the course, we're going to be talking about what happens in the religious sphere, I want to talk about traditional religion a bit, the function of myth, functions of traditional religion, because where we're going to begin next week is with mystery cults, which are going to be, as we will see, based on traditional religion, but a departure from traditional religion. But let's look at where we begin. So the Greek word mythos, which means tale or legend or story. These were oral traditions of tribal communities that serve many functions. So you could explain natural forces. So animistic religion, the god in the stream, the god in the sky, the god in the tree, if you're a Viking. Myths as creation stories, so Genesis and sacred time, cosmogonies. How did everything come to be? Well, the model they had was a genealogical model. So the universe had to be invented, if you will, not as a series of forces, but as a series of couplings of gods and offspring of gods, and gods parenting other gods, and maybe parenting humans. So we had the difference between the word cosmogony and the term cosmology. The suffix of cosmology, logos, it means the study of, or the rationale of, whereas cosmogony is based on the birth of the cosmos. Myths as authentications of ritual. People worshiped certain ways, sometimes lost in time. There was a way that they sacrificed to a particular god. And then the cult existed sometimes before the myth that explained the cult. People did things for God knows. They lost track of the reasons, and then they would make up a story to a lot of Greek myth takes on this form. Things that were lost from 10,000 years earlier were then explained by more recent rational stories. So they were employed to explain and sanction the cult ritual. In Athens, you had the great Pan-Hellenic festivals, of the Olympia and Delphi and Nemea and the Isthmia, which were followed by celebratory games and choruses that evolved into Greek dramas. So these religious festivals were absolutely integral to the culture. Myths also as models for human behavior. So we have narratives of gods that were used as templates and prototypes for ideal human behavior, modeling courage, enlightenment, passion, piety. And they were also just conduits for psychological and emotional expression. So Dionysus became the model for release and ecstatic expression. Reliving myths in that box there, and the communal enterprise of oral epic poetry provided these very intense experiences of inspiration and purgation, catharsis. And this is why the epics were built around those central stories. Myths provided the opportunity to identify with the heroism of Achilles or the ecstatic dislocation of Dionysus, where the god gets ripped to shreds by the Maenads. Religio-mythic explanation forms the fundamental mysteriousness of the world. We're essentially in a religious mythic world. We are passive agents. The gods are the active agents. We're fated. We're what happens by the acts of gods. We are the receivers of. We're not the doers. One of the great breakthroughs in the later Greek curriculum is the whole idea that science and knowledge is empowering. That the explanation, when you believe that the reason something happens is that it is the God in the thing, there's no further investigation. You don't ask the questions of physics. You don't say, but why does this happen that way? Once the answer is, well, the God in the thing. This is the way the God behaves. Well, the God is idiosyncratic. The God doesn't lead to a principled further question. And I used vase paintings to pick up, Athena born from Zeus, Adonis and Aphrodite, Heracles and the Minotaur. The gods, traditional religion. Greeks didn't have a word for religion in our sense. There was piety. In other words, this is the proper attitude towards this is what you're supposed to do. You come to Delphi, you're supposed to, buy a goat and sacrifice it or whatever. It's to have pietas was to do the right thing. The cult, the Threskeia, was the name that they gave to the full ritual. And these rituals were organized as appeasements. If you wanted to find something out from the oracle, you brought a present. You gave something to the Pythia before you could consult her. If you wanted the god's favor, when you made libations, you spilled some of the wine for the god. You gave at the altar when you gave a burnt offering to the god. Now, in the Greek world, we know of course, the Olympians. The Olympians are very late in Greek thought, and the Olympians occur in the Romans had their own versions of each of these, as did the Danes, the Vikings. There's Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and Demeter, etc. They tended to group from two sources. There were the sky gods, common to all Indo-European migratory groups that came into the European and Near Eastern areas. They reflect nomadic culture. They reflect a warrior ethos. And then there were the chthonic underworld gods that derive from agricultural traditions and that have to do with fertility and rebirth and mystery. And it's these that are going to give rise, as we will see, to the mystery religions when we start, and cults, when we start talking about them next week. Any force or power, a dynamis is the Greek word for power, a dynamic, was a god or the effect of the god. They were often linked to specific places around which cult ritual accrued. So Zeus, there's Zeus in all kinds of different places. When a god was associated with a central myth or was an established Olympian, it was said to represent an aspect of the god. So Zeus Volcanos in Crete or Zeus Lycaios in Acadia. If their functions were similar, they in ancient Neolithic periods, they were just the local great sky god. But then now in this more literate period, people are saying, oh, this guy has a function that's similar to that guy over there. And so they must both be Zeus. We're only a half step from monotheism in this world. Haimarmene, fate. In the face of a threatening world, inexorable destiny, human agency seems impotent, the only possibility for control, if you could harvest a little bit of it, was to try to latch on to the power of the gods, the supernatural powers, the demons, the spirits, the ghosts. And this was always magical. And when I say magical, what I mean is that it was instrumental. This is not a treatment of the gods in the modern sense of one has a personal relation. God knows me. God is looking down on little Louis. And we have this relationship and we go through changes together. And I serve him or her this way or that way. Now, magic is instrumental. I can get this from the God. I can have the God do this for me. The guy doesn't know me from Adam. But I can, if I sacrifice, then just maybe this fickle God will look in my direction. This power that usually works against me, this haimarmenic power, might intervene. And so amulets, incantations, charms, spells, rituals were enlisted to create a counterweight to faceless destiny in an unfriendly world. They protected against threats and danger. They warded off the evil eye. They healed diseases and injuries. You could curse your enemies. These were very anthropomorphic gods. They understood enemies. So I could maybe get a good shot in at an enemy by invoking the power of the god through a spell of some kind. They divined or augured future events. I might be able to tell if I'm ever going to get pregnant. They can help the dead in the afterlife. Religion was instrumental, not personal. The practitioner, the acolyte, the person who came to the god, used the god. The god was to be used. And at the bottom here, I just have various ancient artifacts. Tutu, Egyptian protective god. Opera socks, a Roman daimon amulet. Canopic jars for burials in Egypt, mummification.
Mummifications.
Yeah. Magic spells. Here's a Greek ring with a carved in magic spell. So you wouldn't forget it, I suppose. Now, something I will be talking about, because it's emphatically the leading characteristic of religious thought in the periods we're going to be looking at, especially in the first four sessions, the period of about 500 years that we're looking at. It's going, what's called syncretism is in this new cosmopolitan world that's emerging because of Alexander and because of the Greek curriculum. There is, and because of the buildup of the Roman Republic, there is going to be a tendency to assimilate for all these different cultures, which are polyglot and multicultural in that, and lots of parts of this world, in Asia Minor or in Egypt or in the greater Greek world, you could be around lots of people it's the Tower of Babel. Lots of people speaking different languages, they have different modes of dress. They have different ways of worshiping. They're using different gods. Syncretism. You borrow, you merge, you amalgamate, you steal from. All of a sudden, everybody's going native in every different direction. We're going to look at some religious movements, especially when we get to groups like the Gnostics, where they're picking up stuff from Persia, and they're picking up stuff from Egypt, and they're picking up stuff from the Hebrew Bible, and they're picking up stuff from Greek philosophy and Plato specifically, and they're merging it into a new stew. They're just stirring the pot. Now, commentators with an anthropological bent, like Herodotus was one of these, had long noted that foreign gods were equivalent to Greek gods. Oh, Amun-Ra, he's like the Greek Zeus. And the same way that local Greek cults had been thought of by Greeks as being roughly equivalent. Oh, the sky god with the lightning bolt in this place is like the sky god with the thunderbolt. In that place, they're both Zeus, different aspects of Zeus, different appearances of Zeus. In particular, the central god trio of Zeus, Poseidon, the sea god, and Hades, the god of the underworld, had correspondences in all the Near Eastern cosmologies. In the way that Christian saints embody qualities and powers that attract special devotion, foreign gods were often imported into the Greek and Roman worlds with cult names like Zeus Amun or Jupiter Amun, where Amun-Ra, the Egyptian chief sky god, gets incorporated and recognized with temples built to them in Rome, in Athens. And so just a few pictures at the bottom. There's Greek Zeus, but there's Egyptian Ammon, there's the Canaanite Baal, there's the Babylonian Anu, there is the Assyrian Ashur. Not that they were absolutely equivalent, but to somebody who's now thinking in cosmopolitan terms, who has a vocabulary that we will call anthropological. In other words, they've adopted the idea of Greek abstraction and thinking about elements of things being similar to the elements of another thing, and doing comparisons and trying to categorize and clarify and build hierarchies. All that kind of thinking leads to a lot of syncretism, a lot of borrowing, a lot of mutual using. Creation myths, since the fundamental question that's always going to be asked is, where did this all come from? Were originally, the reason I show this Greek theogony, one version, the Greeks had like 98 versions of the way the gods coupled and stumbled before they wound up producing the world and us. This is just one of them. Cosmogonies told the essential story how cosmos means order, how cosmos was created out of chaos, by all these anthropomorphic gods. And since the gods are anthropomorphic and they have passions, and we describe them using human terms, they mate and they have kids, and then the kids have kids, and then fights break out, and then there are jealousies, and the people are having affairs. Zeus is having an affair with a swan, and before you know it, and if you look at this one cosmogony, by the time you get to Hera and Zeus and Poseidon, you're way down the family tree. And Athena and Hermes and Apollo, they're another layer, even. And Persephone, it's like the Greek mythic structures were quite complex. So gods, they're the ones with freedom and agency. But humans are depicted as fated and at the mercy, the fickle mercy of these gods. And only through acts of appeasement, such as ritual sacrifices, were people able to purchase a modicum of good fortune. Priests, oracles, magi, a magus, and a magical expert. These were guides into the sacred unknown in that mythic world. Now, there were cosmogonies in Africa and in Western Asia that were quite familiar to the Greeks and similar. And these Near Eastern cosmogonies, elements of them are going to be incorporated into even the traditional religions that we're familiar with, but we're going to see what really happens. So there was great correspondence in these stories of creation stories around this region. The flood occurs in Gilgamesh and other epics of the period. There's a lot of flooding going on, apparently. The Jonah legend from the Hebrew Bible has a parallel, and Babylonian myth. Gods and the stars are going to be a topic of study, not just for Greek astronomers, but Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek astrologers. Because it's all going to be linked, and the gods live up there, and the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic universe, we'll talk about that in a bit, saw that there were these concentric layers to the sky, if you will, these regions with the gods occupying the highest, the seventh heaven, if you will. The Babylonian belief that gods gave omens, particularly through the stars, became a mainstay of Hellenistic beliefs. The Enuma, Anu, and Lil as a series of cuneiform tablets that gives insight on different sky omens observed by astronomers. So I cut these visuals at the bottom. The Egyptian one is quite a pretty one, actually. The air god is raising Nut, that's the blue sky god, forming the arch of the sky to separate her from Geb, the earth god, down at the bottom. The sky was a heavenly Nile, along which the boat of the sun god Ra sailed from east to west. I always think that's a very elegant looking image. A Sumerian Babylonian image, the figure with streams of water and fish flowing from his shoulders, is Ea, or the Sumerian Enki, god of subterranean waters and wisdom. And here's the Babylonian image of Chaos, Tiamat, battling with the sun god Marduk. We talked about the movement from mythos to logos, putting it in an even larger perspective. Theology, the word theology, the logos of the theos, of the God, is the application of philosophical analysis and methodology to religion. So a great confluence of circumstances drove this movement towards theology. One is, and we've talked about this when we talk about Alexander, the cosmopolitanism. Suddenly, Alexander's taken the Greek world, or the result of Alexander, that's to take the Greek world of all the little city-states, the polis from which we get political, and put them all in the context of one big world order, a cosmos. And so we have cosmopolitanism, the order of the cities. After Alexander, the Hellenistic world had several disparate religious traditions, but an increasingly unified analytic literature or curriculum. So what cosmopolitanism brings is a kind of unification of what had been particularization when the cultures were atomized and very separate one from the other. Syncretism, the similarities in cult and function of gods from different traditions, was not lost on intellectuals who began to think in increasingly reductionist terms. The intellectuals were moving towards, as we will see, to monotheism. All these similarities breed. If this is like that and they've got the same God, maybe there's only one God underlying both those manifestations. Maybe it's not Zeus here. Maybe it's not simply Demeter here and Isis there and Cybele over there. Maybe there's one mother god. Science. Greek philosophy and science look beyond observable particulars in the attempt to understand the universal and both nature, physis, the natural universe, and human nature. The anthropomorphic gods gradually gave way to explanations that featured the forces of the universe. Maybe we're talking about some abstract force, and that the face of the God we put on it is just a kind of shorthand for tribal people that began to be suspected. There is a cosmos. All aspects of the universe were subjected to rational explanation. Everything animate, inanimate, mortals, gods, celestial bodies, everything is seen as linked. It's all linked and subject to the same sympathetic forces. There was a natural order. A change in one thing affected the other thing. That is the Greek word cosmos, the explanation of the world as something born, a cosmogony, with its connotation of inscrutable gods, began to evolve into a world that could be studied and known, a cosmology. This development did not eliminate the idea of gods, but rather created a more sophisticated and complex climate of thought. Now, I call this slide Fate and Divination. the idea of a macrocosm, an entire universe in which everything is linked. And the Ptolemaic, what will come to be known as the geocentric Ptolemaic universe, which Aristotle has a hand in, and then the astronomer Ptolemy, a couple of centuries later, makes clearer, is one in which we at the Earth are in the center, and then you have these concentric rings that are the satellites of Earth. The sun is included in that, the planetary solar system. And at the outer layer is this, they thought of these as concentric shells, and that all these things were moving around like so many electrons in early atomic theory, and that everything sort of moved in orbit in its own shell, and that the shell, if there was a going to be something that was a creator god, was going to be beyond, as we will see, beyond the outskirts of the shell. But all things within this are subject to the same, they're unified, so it's subject to the same forces. Anything that affects something in this universe would affect you on that little orb in the middle of the universe. Governing laws of the universe, connecting linkages are chains of necessary causes, and consequently are determined or fated. But we can study these. So I have this quote here from Cicero in an essay of his called De Divinatione, or in classical, De Divinazione, on divination. Since all things, now this is a man writing in approximately 60 BC in Rome, having gotten his university education in Athens, I would add, so he was fluent in Greek as well. Since all things happen by fate, if there were a man whose soul could discern the links that join each cause with every other cause, a guy who would be really smart, then surely he would never be mistaken in any prediction he might make. For he who knows the causes of future events necessarily knows what every future event will be, for the evolution of time is like the unwinding of a cable. It creates nothing new and only unfolds each event in its order. The macrocosmos. Astrology, alchemy, and oracles are all outgrowths of this assumption that divination has at its core that there is an assumed orderly universe, and that the special expertise of the one who has the knowledge of the expert, this special expertise can be used in understanding the hidden order of that universe. So when one went to an oracle, it was because they thought that the God who knows all things knows the order. But in a world in which they begin to move past gods a bit, the astrologer says, I happen to have made universal conclusions out of certain configurations of the sky. And you remember the Magi and the New Testament story? They show up on Christmas night in Bethlehem because they are following a star that they've, from other observations, they know is a novelty and must be leading us to something new. So they make their way all the way from Babylon, bringing gifts, because the stars have suggested to them that this is going to be the appearance of a new riff in the universe. This is going to be something special, someone special. And they wind up outside the manger. It's a divination. And alchemy. of course, since everything is linked, since gold comes from something, since the principles of physics indicate that there are substrates that can be using clever experimental. We go down to the physics lab and chem lab, and I mix some odd things together, and presto changeo, look what I produce in my little beaker in my chem lab. Well, why can't gold be produced that way? Why can't I, following my studies of the nature of all these base metals, figure out how to transform them? Not as an act of magic, but as an act of reading the nature of things. Divinazione. Here is the stars in that outer ring in this image on the lower right, organized by the Greek zodiac. This is where we get it, that these stars are integrally related and represent, if you will, mythic elements from our religious paths. And so we look at the zodiac in those terms. And our final slide, and this is for this session. And so is born the great Hellenistic analogy, the analogy that you could move from the macrocosm to the microcosm, or from the microcosm to the macrocosm, because everything is linked and everything can be explained through those linkages. So by the 4th century BCE, it was noted that there was a structural similarity between the microcosm of human nature, the way we're built and what affects us, and the macrocosm of the universe taken as a whole. Causal chains from one dimension were seen to reflect causal chains in the other. Divination practices such as astrology were not just used to predict world events, they were now applied to personal outcomes. I can read my horoscope. Isn't that great? An idea that originates with Plato in the great book that was very influential in the ancient period called the Timaeus, has an outsized influence on the philosophical, religious, and occult traditions of the Hellenistic era. The idea is that the cosmos is itself a mind or soul, and that the soul is divine. That if we in the microcosm have mind, can think, and if there is a parallel in this macrocosm, then the whole thing taken together is that what we call God might be a great mind. One of the sources of monotheistic thought came out of this grand analogy. Individual fate and the gods, this view of the world as extremely deterministic, as in the earlier archaic period, humans were enmeshed in a fated web. In one sense, divination just supplied a peek into the oncoming bad news. What evolves in this period is a conception of the gods as protectors through whom people can transcend the bind of fate. A god like Asclepius, the healer, develops at the meeting place of divination and transcendence. He is used to divine sickness, but sacrifices to him can also result in a cure. What we're going to be looking at in the next session is this idea that religion will take on this new aspect, that what passes as legitimate religiosity will no longer be simply faces put on the powers of in the world, the mythic explanations of how physics works, but will now be, if you will, gateways into transcending the limits of this world. And the greatest limit of this world is the limit on life, death. And of course, what we're going to see, the greatest fascination with, is religion suggesting that death can be transcended. Oh, death, where is thy sting? I want to point to this image. This image actually comes from later on. I mean, it's actually an early Renaissance image, but and I believe it is taken. It's taken from somebody who was knowledgeable about Kabbalistic views of the world, and that could have been a Christian or a Jewish Kabbalist. Um, Ab, omnia ab uno, it says at the top, all things from one. So there's this image of the Godhead. And then below it, in that circle below, is natura, nature. And and below nature, those four circles are ignis, terra, aqua, and air, fire, earth, water, and air, the four elements. And we see how these four elements constitute the natural world, image of plant life, and the mineral world, all leading down to us, TB, you, the God, the man. And the word around the man is microcosmos. We are the microcosm of this grander, larger picture. And at the bottom on the base, it says, it's the simple truth. Okay. And this is the assumption, one of the essential assumptions, Hellenistic assumptions that we will be talking about when we talk about the various religious movements in the period between, call it 400 BC and 200 AD. Anyhow, I am going to stop sharing. And here we all are. Anybody, feel free to comment if you'd like.
Worth the wait, Lou.
Thanks.
But I have a question. So
Go
when the
ahead.
when the Greeks were conquering all of these disparate regions, is it possible that the linkage of, oh, you have a god of the underworld too, so do we, was more of a with an eye toward conquering and saying we're the same as you?
That's a legitimate question. I don't know that that was ever a conscious motive, or a conscious strategy. I do think that part of the argument is we're not so different and we bring advantages. So yes, so to some degree, yes, as an answer to that. Anybody else?
Hi, Barbara. I think you answered my question. The time scope of what you'll be covering is 600 BC to, did you say 200?
No, yeah, I would say more like 400. And really, the heartland of what we're going to be looking at, like next week, we'll be looking at certain things that happen in the 400s BC, but we'll be looking a lot at what happens first of all in the next few weeks between 200 BC and 150 AD.
Could somebody, it sounds like there's feedback from somebody.
Yeah, is that better? I don't hear it now.
Yeah. And then
So
just for context, BC and BCE, are they the same thing?
yes, the in Christian circles they used to say before Christ.
Right.
And Jewish circles or non-Christian circles, they say before the Common Era,
Okay.
meaning the same thing, but not using Christ's birth as the separator.
Okay. And
And
eight,
instead,
like Anno
and
Domini.
instead of saying AD, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord, they will say CE, the Common Era, beginning year
Okay.
zero.
Okay. And then just for context, I was trying to, you mentioned that I didn't quite understand the point about the only place for Alexander to go was
Was
east,
East.
because it seemed like they had all the culture, the people, and everything. And yet, in the
No,
end,
no, a lot of wealth, a lot of culture, and a lot of wealth was in Egypt and Persia and Babylon. All
right,
the
but
trade,
somehow the Greek culture is the one that overreached it all.
no, well, only because it's the distinction, not Greek culture so much, but what I was calling the Greek curriculum. In other words, in other words, the Greek world had that one little parlor trick of having invented literacy of a certain kind. And that just was going to become useful to everybody else. It isn't that
Okay.
the culture was superior in ways. One could argue that it had it invented an interesting political alternative.
Okay, thank you. And then I just was curious about China's golden age, and China, I just Googled it and it came a little after what we're talking about. I mean, they
Right,
for a long time, China's golden age, but it looks like the main one, the start of the big one, Tang Dynasty, was 600 to 907 CE. So that's
right.
after.
However, there's going to be great overlap when we get further on in the course. When we start looking at certain traditions that were very popular in the Roman Empire, like Manichaeanism, it was even more important in China, and will last in China until the 14th century. So we're going to see this idea that I opened up about syncretism and adoption of styles and usages from one culture to the next is going to be very, very um, common through all the periods we're looking at. People will be borrowing stuff from traditions that weren't really their own and making new things out of them in an interesting way.
Thank you. Very interesting. It's a lot of new words for me, so I am, trying to keep up.
Good. Thanks. Okay. Harold, you're smiling like the Cheshire Cat.
Yeah, this isn't so much of a question as a commentary. It's interesting to me that n none of these cultures seem to be that aware of or had an overview of what was going on. They were more concerned with, oh, I'm going to go to war with this one to get that territory, or um, that type of thing, rather than um, understand where they were in the universe of that time.
So you're talking about like the Mesopotamian cultures or
Well, as you
whom?
move forward, whatever is there, and no one seemed to have to grasp what else was going on fully. Would you say that?
Um, Basically, taking control of the great population centers seemed to be what the Mesopotamian world had been about for a couple of thousand years.
Mm.
Just let's take over those great cities and those bread
Well,
baskets.
yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. Well, I'll have to think about that.
Okay. Anyhow, we're out of time. Next week, mystery religions and mother goddesses and all sorts of things, and salvation religion, as we'll
Oh.
see.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks a
showing up.
lot, Lou.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks
I
a
hope-
lot, Lou. That was
Yeah, I
very
hope
good.
we'll have worked out all the crazy links. I caused myself a problem by trying to go into a bad link early, and then I had to switch browsers, and I had all kinds of craziness to be able to link to you guys. So anyhow, see you next week.
Right.